Good evening, everyone. Bonsoir à toutes et à tous. Bienvenue au Centre d'études de politique internationale à l'Université d'Ottawa. My name is Rita Abrahamson and I'm the director of CIPS. This evening is the final event in the series that we have called Voting for a Better World Foreign Policy in the 2019 elections. And unlike the previous events that we've had, be it Canada's changing position in the New World Order or the new security threats or foreign aid that we talked about last week, tonight's topic has been right at the center of the election campaign, well, more or less at least recently, because as we all know, on Friday, inspired by Greta Thunberg, hundreds of thousands of Canadians took to the streets across Canada and demanded action on climate change. And we also know from a fairly early poll that Canadians rank climate change as the third issue in this election. But all that said, we still need to talk about climate change and the elections, and hence this panel. Is Canada doing enough on climate change? And what kind of options does the new government, whatever it is, what kind of options does it have as it comes to power? What should voters think about when they go to the polls in a few weeks? To begin this discussion, let me introduce this evening's panelists. Catherine Abreu is the Executive Director of Climate Action Network, Réseau Action Climat, CANRAC Canada, which is a network that brings together more than 100 organizations on climate change and energy issues across Canada. Ryan Katzrosene is a professor in the School of Political Studies here at the University of Ottawa, and he's an expert on the political economy of climate change. Nicholas Rivett is a Canada Research Chair on Climate and Energy Policy in the Graduate School of Public and International Affairs, also here at the University of Ottawa. And his research focuses on economic evaluations of environmental policies. As per usual in this series, for those of you who've been here, every single of them, I've asked the panelists to prepare an opening statement of about 5 to 8 minutes on what they think is the most pressing issue that voters should should consider as we go to the elections. And Catherine is going to lead us off. Thank you, Catherine.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for being with us this evening, and thank you so much for the invitation. It's really great to be here. I always love the opportunity to actually speak with folks who live in the community that I live and work in, because I so often am traveling about and speaking in other parts of the world or in other parts of Canada. How many of you have heard about Climate Action Network Canada? Oh, okay, a few hands. So we're an umbrella network. We have over 100 member organizations, as Rita said. Our members are, as you might suspect, many of them environmental organizations. Great.
Do you want to put it on, or how do you find that?
I think I'm okay.
Yeah.
I only have 8 minutes. Many are environmental organizations, but many are also labor unions, faith groups, health groups, youth groups. And so quite a diverse membership, which makes for very rich conversation and some really interesting, deep strategies. But we're more of an internal-facing organization, so we focus on building the movement for significant climate action in Canada. I do a lot of forward-facing media, but we're not necessarily reaching out to the public all the time. So it's always wonderful when folks in the room have heard of us. We link up to Climate Action Network International, which operates in about 120 countries worldwide and has 1,300 members globally. So we are also part of this amazing international community, and we're able to get this really interesting perspective on Canadian action on climate change, given the fact that we operate at this nexus of domestic and international climate policy and often get that kind of bird's eye view on Canada's contributions from the international space. So I spent the last week bumping around between New York and Montreal to attend both of the climate marches, the one that happened in New York last 2 Fridays ago and the one that happened in Montreal this past Friday. How many of you participated in a climate march? Yeah. That was an incredible experience. about 8 million people marched worldwide over the course of that week. And nearly 1 million of them were in Canada, 500,000 just in Montreal alone. It is quite remarkable to know that in our country, we had probably the largest single climate mobilization in history. And that tells us a lot about where Canadians are when it comes to climate change. We know that climate for the first time is in the top 3 of issues on voters' minds as they head into the polls. And we know that more Canadians than ever know about climate change, care about climate change, and think we have to do something about it. Does that mean that we're going to enter into a new era of climate action in Canada come October 21st? I'm not sure. And that's part of the question that I want to kind of dwell on with you today. We often hear this phrase, well, Canada is only 1.6 or 2% of global emissions, and therefore us doing something doesn't really make a difference. How many people have heard that? Yeah, it's exhausting. What we don't hear very often is that at even the lower end of that range, 1.6% of global emissions, Canada is in the top 10 of net emitters globally. Net. That's not adjusting for population. In the top 10. We've been in the top 10 for the last century. We've never left that top 10 position. And when it comes to per capita emissions, we emit more per person than pretty much anyone anywhere else. We are a big part of the problem when it comes to emissions. And while we might just be in the top 10 in terms of net emissions, we are the 3rd largest producer of oil in the world. So we're a big part of the problem on the production side. We're also one of the wealthiest nations in the world. And when we think about the kind of moral imperative of climate action, the historical responsibility for taking up the Earth's atmosphere by pushing a bunch of industrial emissions into it over the course of the last century, Canada bears a disproportionate historic responsibility for the problem of climate change. And we therefore bear a larger responsibility for helping other countries that are in the midst of industrializing to adapt to the impacts of climate change that they're facing and to hopefully leapfrog some of the mistakes that we made as we were industrializing, i.e. not relying on coal electricity to provide a bunch of our power. But if we kind of move on from that moral imperative to act, and ask ourselves what the history of climate action in Canada looks like, we see that we have a very long history of setting targets in this country and missing every single one. So we've been setting emissions reduction goals in Canada since the early 90s, and we've never met one. Projections, tell us that we're not really on track right now to meet our current goal to reduce emissions by 30% below 2005 levels by 2030. But the last 4 years have been a pretty different time when it comes to climate action in Canada. 4 years ago, the Trudeau administration came into office just a few weeks before COP21 in Paris. That was my first UN climate conference that I got to go to, and it was an amazing experience to see how excited the world was to have Canada back in that space, making a valuable contribution. At Paris, we negotiated what my friend, who doesn't work on climate change, has called the most significant peace treaty of our generation, the Paris Agreement. It is an international treaty that went into effect faster than any international treaty in the history of those kinds of documents. And Trudeau and Minister McKenna came home from that, and they negotiated probably the most comprehensive climate plan that Canada has ever seen with the provinces and territories. It covers pretty much every sector of our economy, and it includes over 50 policies. Probably the only one that you ever hear about is carbon pricing. I've talked more about carbon pricing in the last few years than I ever wanted to. But in fact, there are over 50 other policies that are included in our current climate plan that work together to drive emissions down. So we have these 2 historic documents, the Paris Agreement on the one hand, the Pan-Canadian Framework on Climate Change and Clean Growth on the other. We've put these anchors in the ground for this suite of policies that's supposed to be getting us back on track for climate action. And yet still, we are in this place where all of our efforts combined are completely insufficient. We know that if you add up all of the commitments under the Paris Agreement, it pushes us well past the 1.5 degree threshold that the world scientists have told us we need to hold to avoid the most catastrophic impacts of climate change. And if you add up all of the efforts under the Pan-European framework, those projections are still telling us we're not hitting our 2030 target. So what are we missing? What are we missing? A big part of what we're missing is a conversation around that production side of the problem, what we do with oil and gas. And in Canada, that's a really tricky conversation because we very closely associate prosperity, economic growth, and job creation in this country with our oil and gas industry, regardless of how responsible the oil and gas industry actually is for those things. So what I'm seeing in this moment as we move into election 2019 is a number of parties. We just released a survey of parties that we did on their climate platforms. 4 out of the 5 parties that we surveyed have actually really detailed and ambitious policy proposals for climate action, including the current Liberal government or the Liberal Party of Canada. But something that all of them aren't really getting right so far, with the exception arguably of Elizabeth May, is a really courageous conversation about the future of our economy in Canada as we diversify away from fossil fuel reliance. Having that conversation is going to take courage. And I think what voters are really looking for as they head to the polls is a party, a leader that is displaying the kind of courage it's going to take for us to have that conversation that allows us to take advantage of the multi-trillion-dollar clean economy that's growing globally that we're currently very much missing out on. And that allows us to perhaps mitigate some of the economic losses that we're facing as climate impacts get closer and closer to home. The Insurance Bureau of Canada tells us, for instance, that uninsurable catastrophic losses reached $2 billion in 2018. And they put a lot of the blame on that on climate change. So it's clear that the parties are hearing from voters that climate change is a key concern. And I think at this point, it's necessary for us to have a conversation about how we push our political leaders into a space where they have a real conversation about the part of the picture that's missing thus far, and that is winding down our oil and gas industry and transitioning to a cleaner economy. And I'll just leave it there for now.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you. You can go without. If you want.
Right, yeah. Okay, well, thank you very much for inviting me. We ended up with exactly the same talk. So I'm going to go on the fly here. I've been around climate change since I started as a graduate student almost 20 years ago. And as Catherine mentioned, it's been a depressing slog, all of climate policy over these years. I don't know of any other area in government where failure is this endemic and this tolerated as climate policy. As Catherine said, we have never, ever hit a target that we've set. We've failed every single initiative that we've set out on in terms of climate policy. And so this is an area where it's really difficult to be optimistic. I think climate change or greenhouse gas management has some characteristics that make it a really difficult area for government to tackle. We've seen that in these failures. It's a public good or a common property problem to work together to get the climate we want. We don't have a global government that controls our emissions, and so we have this problem of the scale of government. It's a difficult problem to tackle. We have the problem where emissions of greenhouse gases sit in the atmosphere for decades or even centuries or millennia. And so this is really an intergenerational problem and an irreversible problem in a way that most other problems we tackle. And we have a problem where greenhouse gases are not something where we can find a magic bullet really quickly, because they're something that's released in every aspect of economic activity. So there's really, this is a difficult problem to tackle, and it's a problem, its difficulty is reflected in our kind of continued systematic failure on this policy. And so again, I'm not someone who finds it easy to be optimistic about this, but over the last couple of years, I think we've really seen the beginnings of a reason to be optimistic around this file in Canada. Both at the provincial level and at the federal level, we're starting to see governments, for the first time, adopt policies that are likely to lead to substantial reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, and it will hopefully break this cycle of failure. So not only the price on carbon or the tax on carbon, which has been the kind of headliner, but also really substantial policies in the form of phase out of all coal-fired power, the dirtiest way to generate electricity by 2030. Policies like the adoption in BC and soon to be in the federal government of a clean fuel standard, which will reduce the amount of emissions that are released each time we burn fuel. Policies like a reduction of methane emissions or regulations on methane emissions in oil and gas, promotion of clean vehicles, and the list goes on. So we've really started to see these green shoots in this area. I think, like Catherine, I would acknowledge that these policies are, although they're giving me a real reason for optimism in a file that's otherwise pretty bleak, they're not transformative. They're mostly incremental. And so we're going to see, I think over the next few years, if these policies are kept in place, we're going to see slow reductions in emissions in Canada. These are some of the strongest policies in place anywhere in the world, and so we're going to be, I think, increasingly held up as a place to look to for climate action, as opposed to an embarrassment. But they're not going to, at least the policies that are announced today, are not policies that are going to get us on this trajectory to really dramatically cut emissions over the coming decade, which is what scientists tell us we have to do in order to avoid the worst of climate change. And so with the election, it seems like a sensible time to take stock of what we've done and what we should do next. And so I have three reflections on what I see as big questions facing future development of climate policy in Canada. And the first question is, what's the general approach? And I think with the real energy that youth have brought to this issue over the last couple of years, particularly with the Sunrise movement in the US that's pushed this Green New Deal, there are big questions about how we should be tackling climate change. And the questions are, to simplify it, it relates to, should we be going down this kind of market-based approach like the federal government has taken in Canada? Or should we be thinking kind of more systematic change? Should we be thinking about this a New Deal type approach where government tries to make big infrastructure investments and really transform the structure of our economy? And I think this is one of the questions that really is at the forefront of people thinking about climate change today. A few years ago, it was received wisdom that carbon pricing was the way to go, and you look to the big, and I guess these institutions still stay the same with the World Bank and the IMF, and every economics textbook you open has the kind of prescription for tackling climate change, and it's similar to what we've done in the country here. It's pricing carbon to get the incentives right. It's recognizing there's a failure in fossil fuel markets, that we don't pay the social cost of our fossil fuels. Once we fix those prices, we should be okay. And I would say this youth movement has really questioned that received wisdom and said, well, maybe we should be being much more dramatic in our initiatives and trying to have government really change the structure of the economy in a way that reduces emissions on the scale necessary to achieve this kind of 1.5 degree target. I don't think there's any clean answer to that, but my answer, for me, is that the foundation for climate policy we have in Canada is a really strong foundation, and we should seek to build on that foundation. That we can scale up the initiatives that we have, the price on carbon and the regulations on electricity generation and on clean vehicles and on methane and all the other ones, and we can use those to tackle carbon emissions in a really productive way. My view is that tearing down that foundation and starting again is going to be detrimental to progress on climate change mitigation in Canada and other countries. I think the second big question is how much we scale up ambition, or whether we scale up ambition. And we're seeing some of this question asked in the various party platforms with almost different goals for future climate ambition. I think the big question here is, we want to achieve an environmental goal. We want to balance questions around the economy. So one of the big questions that governments are asked when they pursue meaningful climate action is whether it's going to put our industrial sectors at a competitive disadvantage relative to competitors. So we want to be thinking about that. And we also want to be thinking about setting an international example for other countries to follow. And so balancing all these things is really the kind of order of the game in climate policy and setting the ambition. I think our ambition, at least under this government, is set for the next 2 or 3 years, but I would argue that we can go a lot further over even the coming decade without having to worry too much about these competitiveness losses with our existing set of policies. We've got a set of policies that are structured to avoid those kind of concerns, and I think we can push them further and cut our emissions faster without big concerns on that front. And then the third and most difficult question, I think, relates to fossil fuel supply, just as Catherine was saying. So what do we do? Our focus in our climate mitigation so far has almost uniquely been on demand, cutting demand for fossil fuels to produce greenhouse gas emissions. And over the last few years, environmentalists have had their biggest gains on the supply side, stopping new investments in supply infrastructure. And so they're pushing governments to do the same thing, to try to stop new investments or to stop new infrastructure for fossil fuels. And I think this is a really difficult question. It's clear that the oil and gas sector is an enormous emitter in Canada. It's also clear that it does bring substantial economic prosperity to Canada. One of the reasons our middle class isn't hollowed out like the US is because of our resource sector. So I think this is a really difficult file to work with. In my own view, I would suggest neutrality is okay, that we can push emissions regulations really hard that will affect sectors equally, that will affect people who drive their cars and also affect people who produce oil and gas. And that will be a more relatively politically pragmatic and economically rational way to cut our greenhouse gases quickly. So those are what I see as the 3 big issues. I don't think there's any right answers to those. Those are my takes on them. But I want to leave with a sense of optimism that I feel like this last few years, and hopefully the next few, have really looked to me like the turning point for climate action, both in Canada, hopefully around the world. And it looks like a really strong foundation to build on.
Thank you, Nick. Right.
Thank you so much. And I think I'll speak up. Okay, I think my presentation fits nicely after the last 2, and thank you to the organizers, Rita and Andrew and SIPS. It's great to be on this panel on an important topic at an important time. So I'm going to jump into this. I'm basically going to tackle 3 questions as they pertain to Canadian leadership on climate action. First, where does Canada stand in terms of its international climate leadership? Second, what are the geopolitical and economic risks and benefits, challenges, opportunities of the next government demonstrating aggressive leadership on climate change? And third, what world do we want to live in? As you can see behind here, what world do we want in the future, and what does this mean for Canadian leadership? So the underlying context here is that it's important to identify that Canada does have a legacy of global environmental leadership, at least from a reputational standpoint. So for instance, Canada was invited to chair the UN Conference on the Human Environment in Stockholm 1972, the famous Stockholm Conference, which was really the first stock-taking of the global anthropogenic impact on the environment. Canada was an original signatory to the Convention on Long-Range Transboundary Air Pollution, dealing with acid rain issues, and held the Muskoka Accord in 1985, dealing with acid rain. Canada held the Toronto Conference on Climate Change, which nobody seems to know about, but it was 1998, really sort of seen as one of these galvanizing moments where the international community kind of recognized that climate change was a serious issue for global governance. 1987, Canada held and hosted the Montreal Protocol, which is to this day seen as the most successful environmental agreement. This was the protocol dealing with ozone depleting substances. So clearly there's, again, a legacy of what we could call reputational leadership. As we've just heard, maybe there's some throughout this time, Canada's greenhouse gases are increasing, and we're not pulling our fair share. And we've been missing targets. So there's a discrepancy there between action and word. But I think that the point here is that there's unanimous agreement in the field that this reputation took a real hit during the Harper government years, particularly in terms of the climate file. I don't think that's a particularly controversial statement. And now the question is, where does that lead us today? So I'm going to identify two main narratives to this particular question, where we are today in terms of international climate leadership. We have one narrative which we could call the Canada's back as a global climate leader narrative. Some people like Mark Jacquard at Simon Fraser University are talking about this, all these factors that Canada's played a role in bringing back that reputation. So they played a rallying role at Paris, the Pan-Canadian Framework, which we just talked about, this courageous implementation of a carbon tax, the international reputation that it brings to the table as an actor, and also the Powering Past Coal alliance that it formed with the United Kingdom. We also have another narrative, which we've heard from, I think Catherine represents quite well, this idea of an all talk, no walk form of leadership. So we have, Canada's not just top 10 net emitter, it's also a top 10 per capita emitter, by some measures the worst per capita emitter. We've seen growth in oil sands emissions, and projections show that the emissions will continue to grow. We have the whole Trans Mountain Pipeline debacle, where our government is investing billions of dollars on one hand, talking about climate leadership, and then the other hand buying expensive fossil fuel infrastructure. We have the Commissioner of Environment, Julie Gelfand, issuing reports saying that the government's progress on the climate file is distressing, disturbing is the word she used. And we have the evidence that shows that if the rest of the world took on the same type of targets that Canada did, the same type of action that Canada did, we would be looking at a 2 to 3 degree world. And that's not a world that I want to live in, or is quite frankly acceptable to anyone in the global governance community. So we know that Canada's emissions have mostly flatlined in recent years, whereas in more than a dozen other industrialized nations, including the United States, emissions have been reduced by in the order of 20% since 2005. Our emissions are 2% lower than 2005, and we're supposed to be 30% lower by 2030, in a decade or so. Second question, what are the geopolitical and economic risks, benefits, challenges, so on and so forth, of taking aggressive leadership on climate change? I think it's important to identify that where some people see risk, other people see obvious benefits, and where some people see political and economic costs, others see commercial opportunities. So again, we have two ways of looking at this, two sort of dominant narratives. One is the view that aggressive action on climate change domestically makes Canada this sort of naive, Don Quixote-esque player on the international stage, that we're a sucker. Because, as we're showing leadership, the rest of the world is taking advantage of Canada's climate leadership and the on a domestic level, and the climate is not a beneficiary of that. Iran, Russia, Saudi Arabia are going to keep doing what they do. The United States are going to keep developing their energy resources. Part of this narrative is also that there's a risk that climate action will drive further division, political division, and a risk that aggressive action will cost the economy and jobs. Then we have another narrative, which looks at the opportunities here, and that is that inaction poses a bunch of geopolitical and geoeconomic risks. And Catherine made a nod to that as well. The obvious risk here is that if the world community doesn't take serious action on climate change, we face runaway global warming and devastating, catastrophic impacts. There's a risk that as the rest of the world undertakes transition, Canada's energy sector becomes vulnerable. Right? There's a risk that Canada misses out on financial opportunities associated with clean energy development and new clean tech markets, that Canada will be left behind if we don't jump on board these new innovative markets. There's a risk that weak action will exacerbate political discord, not reduce it. And finally, there's a Security Council seat at risk. There's a geopolitical risk that, quite frankly, if we are not seen to be taking a strong leadership role, we will probably lose the bid for a seat at the Security Council in 2021. Competition is pretty stiff. Finally, final question, I have a minute left. What world do we want to live in, and what kind of Canadian leadership will get us there? The most recent IPCC report of 1.5 degrees makes a very compelling case that every 1/10 of a degree of warming matters. And this chart kind of identifies that as well. I believe that Canada must push the international community towards 1.5 degrees, however ambitious a target that may seem, because the consequences of 2 degrees of warming are quite frankly unacceptable. But what kind of leadership should Canada aspire to? Should it be a reputational leader, which is regarded by the international community as a leader irrespective of actual domestic results? Or should it be a results-based leader, which leads by demonstrating success domestically, regardless of its reputation? Or can we find a way to be a motivational and conceptual leader which rallies Canadians together behind an ambitious domestic climate plan, while also galvanizing real action within the international community, precisely by showing the benefits of strong leadership? And final comment, I think for an effective climate policy to work, we ultimately need to aspire, and I'm saying we here as a Canadian, but Canada ought to aspire to the latter. And in that case, the biggest challenge for the next government, in my view, becomes that rallying act, particularly in a country that is so fractured politically along geographical lines. Each of the parties seem to have their own proposals for addressing this discord, which we can get into in the discussion, but quite frankly, and I appreciate that have the luxury of approaching this from the ivory tower, so to speak. I don't see any of the parties coming quite close to offering the type of political compromise or the targeted incentives that would be required to bring the country together on an ambitious climate plan. And so domestic political polarization, in my view, will likely continue to be a major obstacle, if not the biggest obstacle, to effective climate leadership. And it sounds like I agree with my colleagues agree with me there. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. Thank you to all of our panelists. I'll pick up on your last point, Nick. That this point about rallying the Canadians, rally voters, and given that we've just seen this massive protest that you've all taken part in recently, that kind of would indicate that the people of Canada, the voters, are ready to sacrifice for climate change. But I don't know if you saw today, there was an opinion poll that came out that showed that Canadians absolutely want to save the world and stop climate change, but they're not willing to pay for it, right? So protest is cheap, it's fun, and then you go home and you drive your big car, your SUV, and the poll said that 46% do not want to spend any additional money in the form of taxes or higher costs of goods. And only 22% said that they would be willing to pay up to $100 extra a year. So how do we deal with that?
Well, you ask the economists first. but I mean, to a certain extent, that sounds awful and callous and of individuals, but it's not necessarily surprising. I mean, people, it's a form of individualized oriented behavior, and I think ultimately climate policy recognizes that that's the challenge that we have to come to grips with, and that's why we've approached climate policy from the point of view of incurring costs or increasing a price incentive or other types of coercive, for lack of a better word, policies at the level of the state to essentially force people to behave in a way that's in the collective interest rather than just sort of maximizing their own individual utility.
As the economist?
Right, so I mean, this is I think the salesmanship on the carbon price has been terrible. But the whole idea is that it shouldn't cost things, or shouldn't cost a lot, right? So the idea is this is a tax shift, not a tax grab. They're not raising any revenue from this tax. It's something where they're going to increase the price on fossil fuels to reflect their social costs, collect the money, and give it all back to the households that pay. And so there shouldn't be a big financial obligation for people. It should be something where people are given incentive to switch away from these high pollution fuels. But it's not something where they lose money over. The government of BC went one step further, and when they brought in their carbon tax in 2008, they imposed a tax on carbon, and they said all the revenues are going to be used to cut other taxes, and so it's going to be in one pocket out the other. And the idea is you're going to get pay more for fossil fuels. That's an incentive to use less fossil fuels. And we're also going to cut your labor tax or your income taxes. And so you pay less when you go to work. And so basically this is the tax what you burn, not what you earn is the slogan, right? And so the idea is that they want to give incentives for things that we want, like we want more work, so let's not tax work so much. And we want less fossil fuels, so let's put our taxes up on fossil fuels. It doesn't need to be a net claim on people's money. I think this is something where people have it hasn't been something that's been sold that well. There's a lot of confusion out there. If you look at Andrew Scheer's messaging, this is to say the least not reflected in Andrew Scheer's discussions about the carbon price. But I think it's something where it's not the case that climate action is free, but it's not the case that it has to be government pulling money out of your pocket.
So the premise of that question, how much are you willing to pay for climate action, arises from a decades-long systematic effort to individualize responsibility for climate change. And what does that benefit? Who does that benefit? It benefits those corporations and those individuals who have a financial vested interest in the status quo. Because as soon as you individualize responsibility for climate change, you put people into that self-contained self-preservation framework, and the task looks impossible, and it seems like trying to take on responsibility for that task will interfere with your ability to live a happy life and provide for your family. Those kinds of questions are why we keep getting climate action wrong in Canada, because we keep putting it into that individualistic framework. And that is also what results in the kind of polarization that we're seeing. It makes these kinds of conversations, it makes for very vulnerable targets within these kinds of conversations for politicians who are trying to score cheap political points by kowtowing to the status quo industry and status quo politics that in turn kowtow to the fossil fuel industry. So I am far less interested in how much every individual Canadian is willing to pay for climate action than I am interested in how much every single Canadian wants their government to invest collectively on their behalf in our future. And that's the question that I would be really interested in hearing the answer to. But of course we don't ask those questions because the people who are designing those kinds of goals are kind of locked in this paradigm that in the end just serves the status quo and serves the interests of the fossil fuel industry. So I just take issue with that premise altogether. And when it comes to carbon pricing, I just think it's kind of hard to sell carbon pricing because it's so visible and it's so easy to turn into an individual problem. And it picks up on the vulnerability that people are already experiencing living in an economic system that isn't built to serve them, that is actually built to serve the interests of multilateral institutions. Like that's what neoliberal that's what neoliberal globalized capitalism does. It doesn't serve you, right? And so I think there's already a lot of anxiety and vulnerability that people are feeling, and when they're asked, are you willing to pay money to do this thing? They're like, no, I'm already having a hard time making ends meet. And carbon pricing is so easy. It's so easy to turn it into yet another thing that's making your life harder. And unfortunately, somehow it's the easiest climate policy to understand. And so it becomes a stand-in for all climate policy, and then political opponents have the ability to use it as a cheap way of just getting rid of all climate policy altogether. So I kind of agree with Mark Jacquard, who has said, maybe we shouldn't do this whole carbon pricing thing because it is so easy to turn into a political target. I don't think we shouldn't do the carbon pricing thing. I just think we shouldn't do it in such a visible way. It shouldn't be the marquee thing.
So, Catherine, you used the phrase, we need to change the conversation in twice, I think, in terms of not individualizing it, and also in terms of how do we change the conversation towards pushing political leaders to engage and see the opportunities in the clean economy. How would you begin to change that conversation?
So I actually think first, like, it unfortunately has to rest to some degree in the political parties that are framing this conversation out for Canadians. We right now are in a situation in Canada that's actually fairly unique, where climate change remains a partisan issue. So those who identify as conservatives in Canada, even if they care about climate change, and I know this because that's my whole family, won't vote on climate change, won't vote for a representative that takes action on climate change because they're being told that to do so is out of step with their political identity. And identity is important, right? People don't act because they're given the right facts. People act on their values, and their values are informed by their identity. And so if we're in a situation where those who identify as conservatives think that means that they can't vote for climate action, we're going to keep being stuck. We're going to keep being mired in this position. And I'm not only going to put the blame on conservative parties for maintaining this polarized partisan dialogue around climate change. Climate change is political, but it should not be partisan. I'm going to blame the other parties for using it as an issue to differentiate themselves against. We're at a point now where the climate crisis requires politics of cooperation, not politics of division. And that's, I think, a huge part of what we're trying to get across during this election. Is we need to kind of change the channel in the ways that many other countries have been successful in doing. We can differ on tactics, but we can't differ on the need to get something done. And no one party can do it alone, so they have to figure out how to work together.
Ryan, you were talking about this divided political space as well.
Well, I'll touch on two things that came to mind. One has to do with this issue of framing and increasing that frame of risk being also an opportunity. And there was an article yesterday, I think Reagan Boychuk and Abby Lewis in CBC was talking about how there was a framing issue with a recent story that was explaining that the cleanup of the oil sector in Alberta would cost $260 billion. And Abby Lewis and Reagan Boychuk are saying, well, that's one way of putting it. The other way of putting it is that this is a $260 billion opportunity for Alberta that would actually, if you frame it in that way, we're talking about full employment for Albertans for decades, in the energy sector, no less. So I think there's a role for framing. We're seeing more and more of this. There was a news story recently by Bloomberg, and Bloomberg is very good at framing the economic opportunity of climate action. And they're talking about, a $1.8 trillion investment in adaptation measures results in a point something trillion dollar payback, decades down the road. So that's one thing. The other thing, touching on what Catherine was saying, is the importance of finding those figures, particularly in the right, in the Canadian political right, who understand science of climate change. People like Michael Chong, they are the most important people, I think, in terms of galvanizing a cohesive, cross-party support for climate action, because the research shows people are ideologically sort of predisposed to trust or mistrust the messages of various political parties, and so we have a sort of real dearth of conservative spokespersons who are rallying behind climate action, and they're really important. In the US, there was a study that was showing that climate scientists are what they have to say about climate action, people just don't listen whatsoever. And people will listen to Democrats if they're Democratic, they'll listen to Republicans if they're Republican, but who they really listen to is the US military. And if the US military talks about the threat of climate change from a security standpoint, people from the left and the right in the U.S., and again, the context is different in the US, but that's when people take it seriously. So what's the equivalent in Canada? How can we galvanize? We talk about maple syrup supply, I don't know, but we need to start thinking about this on a sort of strategic communications framework, right? Yeah, healthcare. Sure, healthcare costs.
Right. I think those are wonderful points, especially the point about identity is vexing. I think it's so difficult to tackle, because this is something where it's difficult to think about how to move forward on this issue, just with I think political political parties influence the identity of the voters, and voters influence the message of the political party, and it's very difficult to figure out, who's pulling the strings. I'm not a political scientist, but I think that this hits the nail on the head for thinking about division in our climate policy. It shouldn't be partisan, but it is. It seems to me like one of the areas for potential cross-party support is much more significant investments from government in research and development around clean tech. This is something where I think well, first of all, we invest peanuts in research overall as a country, and we're low productivity. I don't think the two of those are disconnected. And I think that market failures around innovation and environment in clean tech industry are enormous, and that they justify a significant amount more investment. And that could be in areas where Canada already has some advantages, like carbon capture and storage, or even carbon dioxide removal, which is a kind of emerging potential technology that nobody really understands. But it could be in other areas like clean vehicles, or in these new aluminum processes that we're just learning about that are supposed to be able to create aluminum with no emissions. So I think that's one area where potentially there's room for kind of cross-party agreement. The idea that, I'll just say one more thing, I'm somewhat skeptical that government can play a really omniscient role in thinking about where productive new investments can take place. I think this is somewhere where we've got, there's lots of examples of productive investments by governments, and there's other examples where they haven't been so productive. I think about 10 years ago in Ontario of the Green Energy Act, where the idea was to transform our electricity sector, which we did, but also to create these kind of long-lasting green jobs in solar panels and wind turbines in Ontario, domestic jobs, which is the same kind of stuff that we've been talking about today, and they haven't panned out. And it's difficult, again, for governments to really see where the market's going. So they built these wind turbine manufacturing plants that don't have a market for them once the support dried up in Ontario. And I would say that the same kind of concern would be the case with other kind of government-led interventions in kind of supporting an initiative that wasn't necessarily something that the market was supporting its own.
Great. Thank you.